A quadratic is a polynomial in the form ax squared plus bx plus c, where a, b, and c are numbers. There are 4 ways to solve a quadratic: using the square root property, completing the square, quadratic formula, and factoring. This video will focus on the quadratic formula. Solving a quadratic can also be called finding the x-intercepts, finding the roots, and finding the zeros. Note, quadratic formula is not necessarily my go-to method because other methods are quicker if you have the right setup, but quadratic formula works for every single quadratic. So it's a really good thing to have in your back pocket. If that's the only tool you have, go for it. Just know that sometimes it's a little bit longer than some of the other methods. Here are the steps we're going to do. For a quadratic, ax squared plus bx plus c, the quadratic formula is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So the steps for this, first you need to make sure that it's arranged in the right order. Make sure your equation is equal to 0 so that your a, b, and c has the correct signs. Next, substitute your a, b, and c into the formula. Just use the numbers, no x's. Then you're going to want to simplify the numbers under the square root, so just these numbers right here. We want to figure out what that single number is instead of having it as an expression. Once we have it written as just one single number, we can break down our square root. We don't want any decimals, so leave an exact square root. And then finally, when we break down our square root, check to see if this number, anything that you pulled out of your square root, and your denominator, all 3 can be divided by the same number, and if they can, that means we can simplify it, so divide that number out. As a little side note, Alex stops here. I'm not sure why, so make sure you do know how to fully simplify the quadratic formula. I will give it to you on a take-home test, not just homework. So just be aware your homework stops here. Weird. Keep going though for me. So practice continuing on. Let's do 4 examples. Example 1, solve 2x squared plus 15x plus 25 equals 0. So we already have it equal to 0. That's good. We can pick out our a, b, c, and sub it into our formula. Negative b plus or minus the square root, b squared minus 4ac, all over, including your negative 15, all over 2a. We want to simplify our square root, so let's figure out just what this is. Don't type the square root symbol into your calculator, only type in those numbers. If you type them into your calculator, you should end up with a 25. So we have everything else is the same on top, and then I'm going to go on and multiply 2 times 2 in our denominator. Okay, simplify your square root if possible. I hope that you know that the square root of 25 is 5, so that means that I am replacing all of this with a 5. And now, because I got rid of my square root, I just have numbers here in like terms, so I can actually combine them. I can actually say, well, what is negative 15 plus 5? Negative 15 plus 5 is negative 10. Well, what's negative 10 over 4? It's negative 5 halves. So I actually have a number answer here. Or, I mean, we always have number answers, but I have a number that makes more sense than a random weird square root. All right. We did the plus, so now we have to do the minus. What is negative 15 minus 5? That's negative 20. And what's negative 20 over 4? Well, that's negative 5. So my 2 answers to this, if I solve it, I get negative 5 halves and negative 5. If you sub both of those numbers back into the original equation for both of these x's, you should get a 0. The x-intercepts here, if I plotted this on a graph, would be negative 5 halves and negative 5. Okay, that was kind of a bad one to start with because you end up canceling out all your square roots and you don't have to do any simplifying. So let's do another example where we do have square roots in our final answer. Okay, it is already equal to 0. That's good. So we can pick out our a, b, and c without worrying about our signs. And now substitute into the quadratic formula. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac. And all of that, including the negative 8, is over 2a. I'm going to go on and multiply the denominator. And now just type these numbers into your calculator. You should end up with a 28. Alex stops there, but I want you to keep going. Okay, let's try and break down this square root. 28 is 2 times 14, 14 is 2 times 7, so notice I have a pair of 2's that I can bring in front of my square root and a single 7 that stays underneath. I still have my negative 8 and my plus or minus and my all over 6, but my square root was broken down a little further. And now, final step for you to see what I mean about simplifying, you just want to look at this triangle of numbers right here, the 3 numbers that are not part of your square root. Can you divide all 3 numbers by the same thing? Yes, I can divide out a 2 from all 3 numbers. All right, we'll do that. Negative 8 divided by 2 is negative 4. 2 divided by 2 is 1, so we don't even have to write it. And 6 divided by 2 is 3. This is our final answer. This one is a good example because it showed you every single step. It's fully simplified now, and you've had to do everything. Okay, it's already equal to 0, so now let's just pick out our a, b, and c values. A, there's not a number here, but it's implied to be a 1. B is 6, and C is negative 13. So if I sub it into my quadratic formula, negative b plus or minus the square root, b squared minus 4ac, all over 2a. And just like before, I'm going to multiply out my denominator, and then I'm going to type just these numbers into my calculator to get an 88. So don't type your square root, just the numbers. Okay, well, the square root of 88, can we break that down? 88 is 2 times 44. 44 is 2 times 22. 22 is 2 times 11. So just like the last example, I have a pair of 2's that I can bring out, and I have my 2 and 11 that stay underneath my square root. I still have the negative 6, and I still have it all over 2. All right, let's check to see if we can simplify the 3 numbers that are not part of the square root. It has to be all 3 numbers. So if there's not a number in front of your square root like this, you can't simplify it anymore, which is actually good news because you don't have to do extra work. But in this case, I have 3 numbers, and just like before, I can divide out a 2. I promise you it's not always a 2 that you divide out. It's just that's what these examples are. Bad examples, I guess. Oh, I don't even need to write it over 1 because we don't usually write things written over 1. So you didn't need to write this stuff. If I divided out a 2, I got negative 3 plus or minus. The 1 is implied, and the 1 in the denominator is implied, so you leave them out. This is the same answer we got when we solved using completing the square in a previous video. All right, last example, I just want to reiterate how important it is to make sure that you have it equal to 0 before you sub it into the quadratic formula. So this is the only example I have where it's not equal to 0. That means I need to subtract my negative 12 over to the other side of the equation, of the equal sign. Now, A is 1, B is negative 8, and C is negative 12. So make sure that you have the correct signs. Everything needs to be equal to 0. All right, if we sub it into the quadratic formula, x equals negative b, negative negative 8 means this is a positive. You're just changing the sign from whatever b is. Plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And just like before, I am going to multiply my denominator and multiply this in my calculator. It's very important that you put your parentheses here for your -8. Otherwise, you will end up with whatever 48 minus 64 is, a negative number. If this is a negative number, you messed up somewhere. We are never going to have negative numbers in this class. In other math classes, sure, but not in this one. So when you type this in, make sure you use parentheses so you deal with the negative correctly in your calculator. You should get 112. All right, let's break this down. Okay, I have a pair of 2's and a pair of 2's. So 2 pairs, 2 times 2, or 4 comes out, and 7 stays underneath. I still have my 8 and my plus or minus in the front, and I still have it over 2. And just like before, bad example again, because all 3 of these numbers are divisible by 2. It doesn't have to be a 2, it's just that's what my examples have been every time. So 8 divided by 2, 4 divided by 2, you leave your square root alone. Notice I never touched it in any of these. I left it as whatever that square root was. And then 2 divided by 2 is 1, so I don't even have to write it.